Hello, today we are going to go over the disability of visual impairment for our Get Inside the Disability assignment. My name is Courtney Merciel. This is spring of 2023 for class Edsp 711. Our learning objectives for today, we are going to go over visual impairment, the eligibility criteria, diagnostic criteria, types of visual impairments, educational resources to help teachers of students in special education under the VI label, and then a quick demonstration of what it is like to have some of the visual impairments that we will talk about. So today's objective is the learner will understand what a visual impairment is, types of visual impairments, how a visual impairment may affect a learner at school, and discover some sample modifications and accommodations that could be included in the student's IEP. According to KSDE, in order to qualify for a visual impairment on an IEP, the student must exhibit one of the following criteria to receive services. So one of these three need to be met in order to begin the qualification process, and then there must be a need demonstrated from the visual impairment in the educational setting. So eligibility criteria 1 is that records contain information of blindness or visual impairment, which would be that the student depends on tactile and auditory media for learning, or the student would have a chronic condition which interferes with visual learning, ocular motor deficit, like a muscle imbalance, any other vision condition that even with correction, which would be with glasses or contacts, it would adversely affect the child's educational performance. So if even a student with glasses, if their vision is affecting their learning, then they could qualify for an IEP. Another prong to criteria 1 is that measures of the visual impairment indicate that it is either a chronic or progressive condition, which would interfere with learning mode. So even if a student is able to see now, but has a condition that will progressively become worse, and it is documented, they could qualify for a visual impairment label. They also may have an ocular motor deficit. So an imbalance of muscle, maybe one side's muscle does not work as well as their other side. And anophthalmos, which is the absence of an eyeball on one eye, or any other vision condition that even with correction would adversely affect their educational performance. Criteria 2 would be that measures, record interviews, observations, and or tests show that their impairment adversely affects performance. So information from multiple sources of data, whether permanent, fluctuating, progressive, that adversely could affect their educational performance. Also, evidence of any other vision condition that results in impairment that even with correction still affects their education. Other factors that could come into eligibility criteria with this would be that their records of medical information provides evidence of blindness and or visual impairment or a progressive condition diagnosed by an appropriately trained and qualified ophthalmologist or optometrist, such as documentation of cortical visual impairment or evidence that the visual structures are present and working. However, the child does not track, localize, or process vision to receive information. So that would be if a student is able to see, but has tracking problems or focusing within the environment to accurately interpret the information that they are gaining from vision. A diagnosis would be considered as supporting information in that case. However, a diagnosis is not required nor necessarily determinative in eligibility decisions. So that is where, even though a child may have a diagnosis of having some visual trouble, unless it adversely affects their educational performance, then they may not necessarily need an IEP. If the child is ages 3 to 5, they would be under the early childhood umbrella. So that would mean that there would need to be data demonstrating a need for intense or sustained resources across settings, people, or situations. So since standardized testing is a little bit harder to do with ages 3 to 5, they would need to document that resources are needed across multiple settings to provide something for the child. Also, that the data indicates that the disability has a substantial negative impact on the child's ability to participate in age-appropriate activities. And that is, again, because early childhood, ages 3 to 5, typically there's not a lot of reading that is involved. It's those basic pre-reading skills and mapping their environment, lots of play-based learning, all of those. If that child is having trouble participating with their age-based peers, then that could be a demonstrative need for an IEP under the visual impairment label. So in order to obtain a diagnosis, the evaluation and diagnostic criteria for a visual impairment varies. So according to the CDC, visual impairments are most often diagnosed using the best conducted visual acuity, or BCVA test, on the better seeing eye. In the United States, this is typically done at 20 feet using the eye chart that most of us are familiar with, which is called the Snellen eye chart. That is the one with different letters and sometimes pictures for younger children. At that time, when they are doing the best conducted visual acuity, lens refractors can also be used to determine a prescription for corrective lenses if applicable. So if a student is completely blind, obviously they would not have a prescription for corrective lenses. There is also no universal criteria for determining visual impairment. Most clinicians do, however, determine levels of visual impairment based on these averages. So a prescription of 2040 to 2063 would be mild visual impairment. 2080 to 2160 would be considered moderate visual impairment, and 2200 or worse would be a severe visual impairment. In the United States, in order to qualify for vocational programs, government assistance programs, job rehabilitation programs, Social Security, all of those programs, the diagnostic criteria is 2200 or worse. However, the World Health Organization classifies legal blindness at 2400 or worse. So determining if the student would qualify for extended services. There are many common types of visual impairment. Lots of them have many diagnoses, such as glaucoma, cataracts, macular degeneration, all of those. And they kind of fall under one of these classifications of what type of vision is affected by the diagnosis. So loss of central vision would be a blind spot or a blurriness in the middle of their visual field, but their peripheral or their side vision remains intact. You can have a loss of peripheral vision, which is loss of vision on one or both sides of a visual field, but the center line of sight right in front of them remains unchanged. You can also have blurred vision, so vision that remains blurry even with the highest correction available with glasses or contacts. Generalized haze, which is a sensation of film or glare extending over the entire viewing area. Extreme light sensitivity, where standard levels of light within like a classroom or a home overwhelm the visual system, and this can be physically painful to the person. There's also night blindness, where an individual is unable to see very well under starlight, moonlight, or in areas with dim or low light, such as a movie theater or a dark living room at nighttime when lights are off in the house. And then finally, there is blindness, which is the complete lack of ability to see or meeting the criteria of 2200 on a visual screening. And the source is at the bottom if you would like to learn more. So just a little quote, "The world and my life are not dark because I am blind," and that is Linda Hunt. So just some quick facts about visual impairment in the United States and the prevalence of it. As of 2017, 7 million Americans have vision loss or blindness. Of those 7 million, 1 million are completely blind. 1.6 million Americans with vision loss are under the age of 40. So a lot of people tend to think that blindness comes with age. There is still a large amount of people that have become blind or are born blind under the age of 40. More females than males experience vision loss. And then vision loss is very much so more prevalent in Hispanic and African American communities. And so this little chart right here kind of gives a breakdown by demographic, age, and if it was vision loss of 20/40 or worse, or blindness, which they were classifying as 2200. And the source is at the bottom, the CDC. This was a long-range study that was conducted in the mid-2010s and reported in 2017. So some educational implications of visual impairment or blindness in the classroom would be at times delayed cognitive ability. And that could be due to other factors that contribute to the visual impairment. So maybe a disease or visual impairment of prematurity, and also having some learning disabilities in with that. Motor skills may be delayed due to sight loss and tracking the child's environment and things around them. They may be slower to learn to walk, to crawl, to write, all of those basic skills that take in multiple senses. Students with a visual impairment could have headaches due to eye strain and fatigue. And then also physical fatigue due to the energy used to process the visual information that is coming in. That can physically wear out a child. And then finally, decreased reading speed. That can come into play due to the amount of energy that is being used to decode words, either visually or by using Braille. When we tend to decode, we oftentimes look and kind of skim the text. With Braille, the student has to physically touch each letter to figure out what word they are reading. So then it does slow them down a little bit on their speed. Some possible accommodations and modifications that could be put into place for a student with a visual impairment would be to adjust the print size. So large print on assignments and books to make it less fatiguing and more accessible for them. Preferential seating, either closer to the presenter or to the board if they are having trouble at distances, or off to the side if they only have, peripheral vision and they need to be off to the side so that they can look out of their visual field where they see best, or directly in front. So that would depend on the student's need. Task lighting. I actually have a student this year that we use task lighting on in kindergarten due to him not being able to see very well in low light. And that would illuminate the area. A lot of times with our fluorescent bulbs that we use in a classroom, it can create kind of a haze on their papers. So we have been using LED lights to brighten up the task area where this student is working. Guidelines or marked lines where a student either writes responses. So right here, I know it's kind of blurry, but I have some paper with yellow lines, or there's even bumpy paper that a student can use where, they kind of feel ridge on their pencil when they write. and that can reduce visual overload. Oftentimes with my littles, I will trace the area that they need to cut out with a color that's not overwhelming. I don't typically use a yellow highlighter because that can be kind of hard for them to see. So I use like a pink or purple and trace the area where they are to cut out so that they're not working so hard to determine the lines. And then finally, high contrast. So that can be as simple as placing a black paper on the workspace so that the student can see between the two and determine the white paper from the table easier. Okay, finally, we have a quick little demonstration, and this is from a hospital. It kind of goes through some common visual impairments and what it may feel like to see through those eyes. So this is common sight. Cataracts, you can see the glare on the lights and that the color is kind of muted. Once again, normal sight. Glaucoma. So you can see that they're looking through the center vision. Macular degeneration. You can see the hole in the middle of their sight. And there are a few more that are on here where there's a part 2 that has some more ways that you can see some other diagrams. We'll look through. So this would be where all of their peripheral retina's pigmentosa. Floaters, you can see kind of the black. And then diabetic retinopathy. You can see how not only is there a hole, but there's also some floaters in that as well. So I found those pretty fascinating to see, and we will go back to our presentation. And then this is wrapping us up. So in summary, like many disabilities, visual impairment is a continuum, and each student and person that you encounter with a visual impairment will be vastly different. As with many conditions, it can either progress over time or sometimes get better. This is why having a teacher of the visually impaired is highly important, or having them even on consult, just to make sure that when we are doing evaluations and the reevals that the student is having a visual field test done at the school, as well as by their provider, their medical provider. And having that consent to communicate is even more important so that we can continue to determine what is best methods to support the student. So thank you. If you have any questions, my contact information is there. Thank you for listening about visual impairments.